Dracula, of Bram Stoker. Chapter 1. Jonathan Harker's Journal Bistritz, May 3. I left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on May 1, arriving in Vienna early the next morning, should have arrived at 6:46, but the train was an hour late. Budapest seems a wonderful place, judging by the little I could see of it from the train and the short walk I took through its streets. I feared to wander far from the station, as we had arrived late, and would leave as near the book time as possible. The impression I had was that we were leaving the west and entering the east. The most western of the splendid bridges over the Danube, which is here of great width and depth, took us among the traditions of Turkish rule. We left as nearly as possible at the fixed time, and so went on till we reached Klausenburg, where I stopped for the night at the Hotel Royal. In the meal, or rather dinner, I had a dish of roasted chicken prepared with red pepper, which was very good, but highly conducive to thirst. Remember to get the recipe for Mina . I asked the waiter, and he said it was called paprika Händel and was a national dish, and so easily procurable in the Carpathians. I found my German was of very little use here. Indeed, I don't know how I should be able to get on at all were it not for the few words of Hungarian I picked up. Having some time at my disposal when in London, I had visited the British Museum and made a study of the books and maps in the library regarding Transylvania. It had struck me that some knowledge of the country would be useful and important for dealing with a nobleman of the region. I found that the district he had mentioned was in the extreme east of the country, just on the borders of three states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina, in the midst of the Carpathian Mountains, one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. I could find no map or work that threw any light on the exact locality of Count Dracula's castle, for there are no maps of this country as accurate as our own, but I found that Bistritz, the post town mentioned by Count Dracula, was a place of some importance. I shall enter here some of my notes, as they may refresh my memory when I talk over my travels with Mina. The population of Transylvania is composed of 4 distinct nationalities: Saxons in the south, and mixed with them the Walaches, who are the descendants of the Dacians, Magyars in the west, and the Sheklis in the east and north. I am going among this latter group, who claim to be descendants of Attila and the Huns. This may be true, for when the Magyars conquered the country in the 11th century, they found the Huns settled there. I read that every known superstition in the world is gathered into the horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the center of some imaginative whirlpool. If so, my stay may be very interesting. Remember to ask the Count about these superstitions. I did not sleep well, though my bed was comfortable enough, for I had all sorts of queer dreams. All night long a dog howled under my window, which may have had something to do with it, or it may have been the paprika, for I had to drink up all the water in my carafe, and was still thirsty. Toward morning I slept, but was awakened by a vigorous knocking at my door, which I suppose was the porter, and seemed to me to be long and loud. I had more paprika for breakfast, a kind of porridge of maize flour which they said was mummelita, and eggplant stuffed with minced meat, an excellent dish, which they call implatata. Remember to get the recipe for this . I hurried over my breakfast, as the train was to leave just a little after 8, or rather it should have done so, for after rushing to the station at 7:30 I had to sit in the carriage for more than an hour before we got under way. It seems to me that the farther east you go the less punctual are the trains. How they manage to run at all is a mystery. It seemed to me that all day long we were rambling through a country which was full of all sorts of beauty. Sometimes we saw little towns or castles on the top of steep hills, such as one sees in old missals. Sometimes we ran by rivers and streams, which, with the wide, stony margin on each side of them, seemed to be subject to great floods. It takes a lot of water, with a very strong current, to be able to scour the outer edge of a river. At every station there were groups of people, sometimes crowds, and with all sorts of costumes. Some of them were exactly like the peasants at home, or those I had seen on the way through France and Germany, with short jackets and round hats and trousers made by themselves, but others were very picturesque. The women were pretty, except when one got near them, for they were rather stout around the waist. They all wore long white sleeves, and most of them had broad belts with a lot of fringes of something hanging from them like in ballet skirts, but of course they wore petticoats under them. The most barbarous figures we saw were the Slovaks, who were wilder than the rest, with their wide cowboy hats, huge baggy and dirty trousers, white linen shirts, and enormous, heavy leather belts, nearly a foot wide, completely studded with tin nails. They wore high boots, with the trousers tucked into them, and had long black hair and heavy black mustaches. They were very picturesque, but did not look pleasant. In any setting they would be immediately recognized as some old gang of robbers. However, I am told they are quite harmless, and, what is more, quite shy. It was on the dark side of twilight when we got to Bistritz, which is a very interesting old town. Being practically on the frontier, for the Borgo Pass leads from it to Bukovina, it has had a very stirred existence, and it certainly shows signs of it. 50 years ago there were great fires, which did terrible damage on 5 different occasions. At the beginning of the 17th century it underwent a siege of 3 weeks and lost 13,000 people, and to the losses of war were added those of famine and disease. Count Dracula had directed me to go to the Golden Krone Hotel, which, to my great relief, was old-fashioned, for of course I wanted to see as much as possible of the customs of the country. I was evidently expected, for when I got near the door I was met by a cheery-looking woman, well advanced in years, dressed in peasant fashion, white underclothing with a double apron, in front and behind, of brightly colored stuff, so tight to the figure that it could not be called modest. As I came up, she bowed and said, "The English gentleman?" "Yes," I replied, "Jonathan Harker." She smiled and gave some instructions to an old man in white-sleeved shirt, who had followed her to the door. The man went away, but returned immediately with a letter, "My dear friend, welcome to the Carpathians. I am expecting you anxiously. Sleep well tonight. Tomorrow at 3 the diligence starts for Bukovina, you have a place reserved. At the Borgo Pass my carriage will be waiting for you and will bring you to my house. I hope that your journey from London has been smooth, and that you will enjoy your stay in my beautiful country. Your friend, Dracula." May 4th. I found that my host had received a letter from the Count, directing him to secure the best place in the coach for me, but on inquiring as to details, he became somewhat reticent, and pretended not to be able to understand my German. This could not have been true, for he had understood me perfectly up to then, at least he had answered my questions exactly as if he understood them. He and his wife, the old woman who had received me, looked at each other in fear. He muttered that the money had been sent in one letter, and that was all he knew. When I asked him if he knew Count Dracula and could tell me anything of his castle, both he and his wife crossed themselves, and saying that they knew nothing at all, simply refused to say anything more. It was now so near the time of starting that I had no time to ask anyone else, but everything seemed to me very mysterious and by no means reassuring. A few minutes before starting, the old woman came up to my room and said, in a nervous voice, "Must you go? Oh, young gentleman, must you go?" She was in such a state of excitement that she seemed to have lost the little German she knew, and mixed it all up with some other language of which I did not understand a word. I could scarcely follow her by asking many questions. When I told her that I must go at once, and that I was engaged on important business, she asked again, "Do you know what day this is?" I answered that it was the 4th of May. She shook her head and spoke again, "Oh, yes. That I know. That I know, but, do you know what day this is?" When I replied that I did not understand her, she went on, "It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you not know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway? Do you know where you are going and what you are going to?" She was in such a state of despair that I tried to calm her, but without effect. Finally, she fell on her knees and implored me not to go, to at least wait 1 or 2 days before leaving. All this was rather ridiculous, but I did not feel tranquil. However, I had business to arrange, and could not allow anything to stand in my way. I therefore tried to lift her up, and told her, as seriously as I could, that I thanked her, but that my duty was imperative and I had to go. Then she rose and dried her eyes, and taking a crucifix from her neck, she offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for as a faithful member of the Church of England, I have accustomed myself to look on such things as symbols of idolatry, and yet, it seemed discourteous to refuse it to an old woman with such good intentions and in such a state of mind. I suppose she could read the doubt on my face, for she put the rosary around my neck, and said, "Open quotes for your mother's sake," close quotes, and then went out of the room. I am writing this part of my journal while I wait for the coach, which, of course, is late, and the crucifix still hangs around my neck. I do not know whether it is the old woman's fear or the many ghostly traditions of this place, or the crucifix itself, but I am certainly not as tranquil as usual. If this book ever reaches Mina's hands before me, may it carry my farewell. Here comes my coach. May 5th. The castle. The darkness of the morning has passed, and the sun is high over the distant horizon, which seems pursued, I do not know whether by trees or by hills, for it is so far away that big and small things blend. I am not sleepy, and, as I shall not be called till I wake naturally, I write on till sleep comes. There are many queer things I would like to set down, and lest anyone reading them may imagine that I dined too well before leaving Bistritz, I shall also put down exactly what my dinner was. I dined on what they call open quotes stolen beefsteak close quotes, with slices of bacon, onion and beef, all seasoned with red pepper threaded on sticks and roasted. In the simple style of the open quotes cat's meat close quotes of London. The wine was golden meadish, which produces a peculiar stinging on the tongue, which, however, is not disagreeable. I only drank a couple of glasses of this wine, and nothing more. When I got to the coach, the conductor had not yet taken his seat, and I saw him talking with the landlady of the inn. They were evidently talking of me, for now and then they turned to look at me, and some of the people who were sitting on the bench outside the door open parentheses whom they call by a name that signifies open quotes word bearers close parentheses came near and listened, and then looked at me, most of them pityingly. I could hear many words which were often repeated, queer words, for there were many nationalities in the group, so I quietly extracted my polyglot dictionary from my portmanteau, and looked them up. I must admit that they did not produce any joy in me, for among them were open quotes ordered close quotes open parentheses Satan close parentheses, open quotes Pokol close quotes open parentheses Hell close parentheses, open quotes Strigolka close quotes open parentheses which close parentheses, open quotes Vrlak close quotes and open quotes Vlkoslak close quotes open parentheses which mean the same thing, one in Slovak and the other in Serbian, designating something that is either a werewolf or a vampire close parentheses. Open parentheses. Remember, I must ask the Count about these superstitions close parentheses. When we started, the crowd around the inn door, which had by that time grown to a considerable number, all made the sign of the cross and pointed 2 fingers towards me. With some difficulty I got a passenger companion to tell me what it all meant. At first he would not answer me, but when he knew that I was English, he explained that it was the charm or spell against the evil eye. This also did not please me much when I was going out to an unknown place with an unknown man, but everyone seemed so kind, so compassionate and so sympathetic that I could not help being moved. I shall never forget the last glimpse I had of the courtyard of the inn and its crowd of picturesque characters, all crossing themselves, as they stood around the wide porch, with its background of rich foliage of oleanders and orange trees and green tubs clustered in the center of the yard. Then our conductor, whose wide linen trousers covered the whole front seat (they call him goes whipped his great whip over the 4 small horses that ran 2 by 2, and we started on our journey puntos suspensivos. Soon I lost sight and memory of the ghostly fears and the beauty of the scene through which we were passing, although if I had known the language, or better, the languages spoken by my fellow travelers, it is quite possible that I should not have been able to get rid of them so easily. Before us stretched the green sloping field full of forests with steep hills here and there, crowned with clusters of clover or with peasant houses, with their empty walls looking toward the road. On all sides there was a maddening amount of fruit in bloom, apples, plums, pears, and strawberries. And as we advanced, I could see how the green grass under the trees was covered with fallen petals. The road went in and out among these green hills of what they here call Middle Earth, freeing itself by sweeping around curves, or enclosed by the strangling arms of the pine forests, which here and there ran down the hill like tongues of fire. The road was rough, but in spite of this it seemed that we flew with an exciting haste. Then I could not understand what caused this haste, but evidently the conductor did not want to lose time before reaching the Borgo Pass. I was told that the road was excellent in summer, but that it had not yet been repaired after the winter snows. It was different in this respect from most of the Carpathian roads, for it is an old tradition that they should not be kept in too good order. From ancient times the Hospodars could not repair them, for then the Turks would think they were preparing to bring in foreign troops, and thus stir up the war that was always truly on the point of breaking out. Beyond the green, swelling hills of the Middle Earth rose mighty forest-covered hills, with the elevated summits of the Carpathians. They rose on our left and right, with the afternoon sun falling full upon them and bringing out the glorious colors of this beautiful mountain range, deep blue and purple in the shadows of the peaks, green and brown where grass and stone mingled, and an infinite perspective of jagged rocks and pointed crags, till they themselves were lost in the distance, where the snowy summits stood up grandly. Here and there mighty rifts seemed to cleave the mountains, through which, as the sun began to sink, we saw on some occasions the white gleam of falling water. One of my companions touched my arm as we swept round the base of a hill and pointed to a lofty, snow-covered peak, which seemed, as we advanced on our winding road, to be right before us. Look! Ilsen the throne of God. He said, and crossed himself again. As we continued on our interminable road and the sun sank farther and farther behind us, the shadows of evening began to close around us. This fact was enhanced because the tops of the snowy mountains still received the sun's rays, and seemed to glow with a delicate, cold, pink color. Here and there we passed Slovaks and Czechs, all in their picturesque costumes, but I noticed that goiter painfully prevailed. Along the road there were many crosses, and as we passed, all my companions crossed themselves before them. Here and there was a peasant woman kneeling before an altar, without even turning to look at us as we approached, but rather seeming, in the rapture of devotion, to have neither eyes nor ears for the outer world. Many things were quite new to me, for instance, heaps of straw in the trees, and here and there, very beautiful groups of weeping willows, with their white branches gleaming like silver through the delicate green of the leaves. Over and over again we passed a caramato, open parentheses the ordinary peasant cart close parentheses, with its long, sinuous backbone, calculated to suit the inequalities of the road. In each of these sat a group of peasants returning home, the Czechs with their white sheepskins and the Slovaks with their colored ones. The latter wore their long staves as spears, with an axe at the end. As night began to fall it grew very cold, and the increasing gloom seemed to blend into one haze the dreariness of the trees, oaks, beeches, and pines, though in the valleys running deep through the furrows of the hills, as we ascended towards the pass, the dark firs stood out against the background of late snow. Sometimes, as the road was cut through the pine forests, which seemed to approach us in the dark, great gray masses which were scattered here and there among the trees produced a dreary and solemn effect, which revived the thoughts and the sinister fantasies engendered by the afternoon, whilst the setting sun seemed to throw a strange comfort on the ghostly clouds that, among the Carpathians, seemed to wander ceaselessly through the valleys. On certain occasions the hills were so steep that, despite the haste of our conductor, the horses could only advance very slowly. I wanted to get out of the coach and walk beside them, as we do at home, but the coachman would not hear of it. "No, no," he said, "you must not walk here. The dogs are very fierce," he said, and then added, with what was evidently intended for a grim joke, for he looked around to catch the affirming smiles of the others, "You will have quite enough to do before you go to sleep." So the only stop he made for a moment was to light the lamps. As it grew darker the passengers seemed to get more nervous and kept speaking to the coachman one after another, as if urging him to greater speed. He whipped the horses unmercifully with his long whip, and with wild shouts of encouragement tried to force them to greater exertions. Then, through the gloom, I could see a sort of gray patch of light ahead of us, as if there were a cleft in the hills. The unrest of the passengers increased, the mad carriage swayed on its great leather springs, and rocked from side to side like a ship floating on a stormy sea. I had to hold on. The road grew leveler and we seemed to fly over it. Then the mountains seemed to close in on us from both sides, as if they wished to strangle us, and we found ourselves at the entrance of the Borgo Pass. One by one all the passengers offered me presents, insisting in such a sincere way that there was no way to refuse to receive them. The gifts were, of course, of very diverse and strange kinds, but each one gave it to me so willingly, with such kind words, and with a blessing, that strange mixture of fearful movements I had already seen outside the hotel in Bistritz, the sign of the cross and the spell against the evil eye. Then, as we flew along, the coachman leaned forward and, on each side, the passengers, leaning over the coach windows, peered anxiously into the darkness. It was evident that something strange was expected to happen, but although I asked each of the passengers, none gave me the slightest explanation. This state of mind lasted some time, and at last we saw the pass open out towards the east. Dark, gloomy clouds hung over us, and the air was heavy, charged with the oppressive feeling of thunder. It seemed as if the mountain range separated two atmospheres, and that we had now entered the stormy one. I began to look myself for the vehicle that was to take me to the Count's residence. Every moment I expected to see the flash of lamps through the blackness, but all remained in the deepest darkness. The only light came from the flickering rays of our own lamps, in which the steam from our exhausted horses rose like white clouds. Now we could see the sandy road extending white before us, but on it there was no sign of a vehicle. The passengers leaned back with a sigh of relief, which seemed to mock my own disappointment. I was already thinking what I could do in such a situation when the coachman, looking at his watch, said something to the others that I could barely hear, so soft and mysterious was the tone in which he said it. I think it was something like open quotes an hour early close quotes. Then he turned to me and said in German worse than mine, "There is no carriage here. After all, nobody expects the gentleman." You had better come now to Bukovina and return tomorrow or the next day, better the next day." As he spoke, the horses began to paw and whinny, and rear so wildly that the coachman had to hold them firmly. Then, amidst a chorus of shrieks from the hastily crossing peasants, a caleche appeared behind us, passed us, and stopped beside our coach. By the light of our lamps, as the rays fell upon them, I could see that the horses were splendid animals, black as coal. They were driven by a tall man, with a long grizzled beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see the gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the glare of the lamp. In the moments when the man turned to us, he addressed the coachman, "You arrived very early today, my friend." The man replied stammering, "The English gentleman was in a hurry." Then the stranger spoke again, "I suppose then that is why you wished him to continue to Bukovina. You cannot deceive me, my friend. I know too much, and my horses are swift." And as he spoke he smiled, and when the light of the lamp fell upon his fine, hard mouth, with very red lips, his sharp teeth gleamed white like ivory. One of my companions whispered to another that phrase from Berger's "Leonora" "Den die Toten reiten schnell" for the dead travel fast. The strange driver evidently heard the words, for he looked up with a glittering smile. The passenger hid his face at the same time that he made the sign with the 2 fingers and crossed himself. "Give me the gentleman's luggage," said the strange coachman. With excessive readiness my bags were taken out and placed in the caleche. Then I got out of the coach, for the caleche was situated beside it, and the coachman helped me with a hand that grasped my arm like a steel vice. His strength must have been prodigious. Without saying a word he shook the reins, the horses turned halfway around, and we slid into the darkness of the pass. Looking back I saw the steam of the coach horses in the light of the lamps, and projected against it the figures of my until recently companions, crossing themselves. Then the coachman cracked his whip and shouted to the horses, and all started toward Bukovina. As they disappeared in the darkness I felt a strange chill, and a feeling of loneliness came over me. But my new coachman covered my shoulders with a cape and placed a blanket over my knees, then spoke in excellent German, "The night is cold, my lord, and my lord the Count asked me to take good care of you. Under the seat there is a bottle of Slivovitz, a local plum liqueur, in case you care for some." But I took nothing, although it was nice to know there was a provision of liqueur. I felt a little strange, and no less afraid. I think if there had been any alternative, I would have taken it instead of continuing that mysterious night journey. The carriage advanced at a rapid pace, in a straight line, then we made a complete curve and entered another straight road. It seemed to me that we were simply circling again and again over the same place, so I made a note of a prominent point and confirmed my suspicions. I would have liked to ask the coachman what it all meant, but I was really afraid, for I thought that, in the situation I was in, any protest could not produce the desired effect in case there had been an intention of delay. After a while, however, feeling curious to know how much time had passed, I lit a match, and in its light looked at my watch. It was a few minutes before midnight. This gave me a sort of start, for I suppose that the general superstition about midnight had been increased by my recent experiences. I remained waiting with a sickening sense of anxiety. Then a dog began to howl at some peasant house farther up the road. It let out a long, mournful howl, as if it were afraid. Its call was picked up by another dog and by another and another, until, borne like the wind that now passed softly through the pass, a terrifying concert began of howls that seemed to come from all points of the countryside, from as far as the imagination could grasp through the darkness of the night. From the first howl the horses began to paw and fidget, but the coachman spoke soothingly to them, and they regained their calm, although they trembled and sweated as if they had just passed through a sudden fright. Then, in the far distance, from the mountains that were on each side of us, came a much louder and sharper howl, the howl of wolves, which affected the horses and myself in the same way, for I was about to jump out of the caleche and run, while they backed away and reared frantically, so that the coachman had to use all his strength to prevent them from bolting. However, after a few minutes my ears had become accustomed to the howls, and the horses had calmed down so much that the coachman was able to get out and stand in front of them. He rubbed and stroked them, and whispered something in their ears, just as I have heard horse trainers do, and with such an extraordinary effect that under this petting they became quite obedient again, although they were still trembling. The coachman took his seat again, shook his reins, and we resumed our journey at a good pace. This time, after reaching the far side of the pass, he suddenly crossed by a narrow path that entered sharply to the right. Soon we found ourselves obstructed by trees, which in some places covered the road completely, forming a kind of tunnel through which we passed. And besides that, gigantic, threatening boulders formed a barrier on one side and the other. Despite being thus protected, we could hear the wind rising, for it moaned and whistled through the rocks, and the branches of the trees clashed with each other as we passed along the road. It grew colder and colder and a fine snow began to fall, so that at the moment everything around us was covered by a white blanket. The sharp wind still carried the howls of the dogs, although these were decreasing as we moved away. The howling of the wolves, on the other hand, approached closer and closer, as if they were closing in on us from all sides. I felt terribly distressed, and the horses shared my fear. However, the coachman did not seem to have any fear. He continually turned his head to the left and to the right, but I could not see anything through the darkness. Suddenly, far away to the left, I saw the faint glow of a blue flame. The coachman saw it at the same time. He immediately stopped the horses and, jumping down, disappeared into the darkness. I did not know what to do, and much less because the howls of the wolves seemed to be approaching, but while I hesitated, the coachman suddenly appeared again, and without saying a word took his seat and we resumed our journey. I think I must have fallen asleep or dreamed repeatedly of the incident, for it recurred again and again, and now, remembering it, it seems to me that it was a kind of horrifying nightmare. Once the flame appeared so close to the road that even in the darkness that surrounded us I could observe the coachman's movements. He quickly went to where the blue flame was. It must have been very faint, because it did not seem to light up the place around it, and taking some stones he placed them in a significant shape. On one occasion I was the victim of a strange optical effect. As he stood between the flame and me, he did not seem to obstruct it, for I continued to see its ghostly luminosity. This astonished me, but as it was only a momentary effect, I supposed that my eyes had deceived me due to the strain I was under in the darkness. Then, for a time, the blue flames did not appear again, and we sped swiftly through the darkness with the howls of the wolves surrounding us, as if they were following us in enveloping circles. Finally the coachman went farther away than he had done until then, and during his absence the horses began to tremble more than ever and to paw and whinny with fear. I could not see any cause for their nervousness, for the howls of the wolves had ceased completely, but then the moon, sailing through the black clouds, appeared behind the jagged crest of a pine-clad rock outcrop, and in its light I saw around us a circle of wolves, with white teeth and red, hanging tongues, with long sinuous limbs and shaggy hair. They were 100 times more terrible in that gloomy silence that surrounded them than when they were howling. For my part, I fell into a kind of paralysis of fear. Only when man comes face to face with such horrors can he understand their true meaning. Suddenly, all the wolves began to howl as if the light of the moon produced a peculiar effect on them. The horses reared and backed away, and looked around helplessly with eyes that rolled painfully, but the living circle of terror accompanied them on each side. They were forced to remain within it. I shouted to the coachman to return, for it seemed to me that our last alternative was to try to break through the circle, and to help him in his return. I shouted and beat on one side of the caleche, hoping that the noise would scare the wolves away from that side and thus give him a chance to get into the coach. How he finally arrived is something I do not know, but I heard his voice rise in an imperious tone of command, and looking toward the place from which it came, I saw him standing in the middle of the road. He waved his long arms as if trying to push away an impalpable obstacle, and the wolves retreated, just as a heavy cloud passed across the face of the moon, so that we sank back into darkness. When I could see again, the conductor was climbing into the caleche and the wolves had disappeared. All this was so strange and mysterious that I was overcome by a panic fear, and had no courage to move or speak. The time seemed endless as we continued our journey, now in the most complete darkness, for the black clouds obscured the moon. We continued to ascend, with occasional periods of rapid descents, but ascending most of the time. Suddenly I became aware that the driver was stopping the horses in the courtyard of a huge, partially ruined castle, from whose high black windows not a single ray of light came out, and whose broken walls showed a jagged line that stood out against the moonlit sky. Ellipsis.